I want to begin by offering you a challenge. Define race. Tell me, is it physical appearance? Is it a matter of culture or style? Is it a matter of ancestry, where on the planet your people hail from? Define race and do it in such a way that your definition cannot be shredded in just a question or two. While you're wrestling with that, I want to tell you a story. In August, it will be 23 years since my family and I went through a hurricane named Andrew. We had been on the road on vacation for the week prior to the storm, so we had literally no idea that this thing was out there bearing down on South Florida until the night before we were to get home, when we called and spoke to our neighbors, Pam and Joe, who had been keeping an eye on the house, and asked them, how's everything in the neighborhood? And they told us this monster storm is coming, and for God's sake, stay where we are. Here is what an idiot I was. Because I had never been through a hurricane before, I had never given hurricanes much thought, having grown up in Southern California, I really had no idea what a hurricane was. I figured, okay, the wind is going to blow, the house is going to creak, the windows are going to rattle, maybe the power will go out. I thought it might even be fun in a perverse sort of way. So we drove home against all that good advice and ended up spending the night in a house whose windows we had fortified with tape. Tape. It is evidence of the truism of that axiom about God taking care of children and fools that I am here talking to you about it all these years later. My wife, my 5 kids, and I spent that night huddled in the bedroom closet. Came out the next day, found that our roof had been peeled away, and everything we had, nearly everything we had, was gone, had been destroyed. When we ventured out of the house, we saw that everyone was in the same predicament. Everyone was in the same boat. We all had the same thing. We all had nothing. No electricity, no lights, no air conditioning, no refrigerator, no safe shelter, very little money, and no place to spend money even if you had it. We had all been reduced to a primitive, pre-industrial society whose primary goal was simple survival. Figuratively and literally, all the fences between us had been torn down. So I remember this one day I heard on the radio that this store up in Broward had gotten in a shipment of ice. You'd be shocked the stuff that is really important to you when you don't have anything. Some of you may remember in South Florida, right after Hurricane Andrew, ice was white gold. So I jumped into the one of our 2 cars that did not have a tree in it and drove up to Broward, stood in this long line at the supermarket, came home lugging 10 bags of ice to a house that I suddenly realized did not have a refrigerator. And the only thing that we had for cold storage was a small papier-mâché ice chest. Had no idea what I was going to do with all that ice. But not long after I got home, this lady comes by. At her house, they've managed to hook up a gas grill, and they're cooking all the meat in the freezer and the refrigerator before it can spoil. Would you like some chicken, she says. I've got some ice, I tell her. You'd have thought I'd offered that woman $1 million bill. She went away literally hugging bags of ice, and my family and I enjoyed the first hot meal that we'd had in days. I never saw that woman again. It is a bittersweet memory because I think it speaks eloquently to the true nature of human community. So often, we fool ourselves into thinking that we bond most strongly with and against each other based on markers of identity, based on race, religion, creed, sexual orientation, gender, or political affiliation. But so often, these things are just stand-ins, just proxies for the ties that really bind, meaning common needs, common hopes, common goals, common fears, common values, common dreams. We tend to forget that sometimes because those other things are so visceral and so distracting, especially race. Race has this way of making itself seem to be the most important factor in the equation. Like a high beam light dead in the eyes, race has this way of obscuring everything around it. Then the crisis comes, and the old paradigms fall, and suddenly you find that those things don't matter so much anymore. Black or white, gay or straight, red state or blue, who cares? All that matters is we are going through something, and maybe if we help each other, we might all get through it together. All that matters is I've got the ice if you've got the chicken. It is the ongoing challenge of human beings to learn to see those paradigms for the falsehoods they are, even after the shadow of crisis has passed. And this is not easy. We are so wedded to the idea that you can tell what a person is about, that you can judge a person once you know those few markers of identity, once you've established his sexual orientation or his religion. And then there's race, always race. The notion that you can objectively, that you can tell what a person is about, that you can know who a person is by skin color or by culture or by place of ancestral origin, is a fascinating idea, awesome in its sheer stupidity. One of the most fascinating things about it is that we continue to buy into it without question, that we regard it as an objective and scientific certainty when the truth is, it is anything but. Now, it was not always this way. Nell Irwin Painter, author of the book, The History of White People, writes that our modern conception of race is only about 300 years old. Prior to that, she says, we attempted to impute fixed characteristics on other people based on things like factors of climate or geography, how hot or cold it was where your ancestors are from, or how far above or below sea level. So for instance, people who were from southern climes were said to be hot-tempered, temperamental, and passionate. People who were from northern climes were said to be cool-headed, cerebral, and dispassionate. Anybody remember the old TV show Bonanza? Fans of Bonanza, where hot-headed little Joe Cartwright was said to be from New Orleans, but his cool and dispassionate older brother Adam was from the Northeast, ought to recognize that paradigm. People who remember the old stereotype about hot-blooded Latina women and their excitable men should recognize it too. Gradually, however, race came to supplant those other factors. Race was simpler and more useful, not least in justifying the genocide or the near genocide of the original inhabitants of this land, and of course the African slave trade. Noel Ignatieff, author of a book called How the Irish Became White, put it as follows. He said, Africans did not become slaves because they were black. They became defined as black because they were enslaved. That is a powerful and perceptive observation, but of course it flies in the face of everything that we have been told. We have been taught in this country that our scientists have spent years trying to quantify race. They've told us that it could be found in the shape of the skull, in the width of the space between the eyes, in the protrusion of the jaw. Arbiters of culture have told us that it was a certain way of walking, a certain way of talking, an inflection in your speech, a style of dance, or the rhythm of your blues when you sang. The anthropologist D.B. Britton, in 1895, published an influential chart purporting to classify all the races of humankind, he ended up with over 100 different kinds of white people alone. The unreality of race is a big part of the reason that the language that we use to describe it never seems to quite fit or to quite last. Example, both my parents were colored. I was born a Negro. When I was 10, I became black. In middle age, I find myself to be African American. So at some point you would think that we would begin to question our assumptions. But unfortunately, unfortunately, we never do. We remain wedded to the idea that there is some objective reality to this construct, to this idea, when, as a matter of fact, there is none. And the problem with the idea that race is, is somehow real is that it tends to create not just a self-fulfilling prophecy, but that it concretizes young people and older people, I guess, into visions that really have nothing to do with them. You remember a moment ago when I said that race tends to obscure? There's been a lot of talk. We spent a lot of time talking about recently about the deaths of unarmed African American men in police custody: Trayvon Martin, Eric Grant, Amadou Diallo, Michael Brown. And you will recall that to that, men like Rudolph Giuliani told us that we should spend less time lamenting those things and more time lamenting the scourge of black-on-black crime. And that's very curious. As I said, race obscures. As it happens, there is a minority group in this country whose involvement in crime is actually more disproportionate than that of African Americans. This particular minority group is responsible for up to 62% of all arrests for property crime and a whopping 80% of all arrests for violent crime. So if you took this one particular minority group out of the picture, if you're able to get this one particular minority group under control, you would go a long way toward completely eradicating crime in this country. The minority group in question is called men, or male Americans if you prefer. And if you find that a ridiculous idea, well, yeah, but please understand that the ridiculousness of it is precisely the point. The idea that we can quantify a tendency toward criminality based on skin color makes about as much sense as the idea that we can quantify it based on anything else. Yet, the fact that we continue to speak so freely and so frequently of crime in terms of race, but almost never in terms of chromosomes, almost never in terms of education, in terms of poverty, speaks volumes, I think, to the boundaries that we choose to imbue with great meaning and those that we choose to ignore. It speaks to this tendency that we have to reduce people to race, as though everyone bearing the same skin color or the same eye shape were an indistinguishable monolith. Same taste in music, same religious outlook, same political outlook, same everything. If you've met one, you've met them all. That is an implicit belief that denies the individuality and thus the humanity of everyone to whom it is applied. It is an act of emotional violence, but it's an act of emotional violence that we commit every day with regard to race. Like everyone in this room, I am many things. I am African American, yes. And there are times, yes, and circumstances, yes, when that is absolutely the most important and relevant thing about me. But I am also a Christian, a follower of the radical gospel of Jesus Christ. I am also a comic book fanboy, often to be found wearing my Spider-Man t-shirt standing in line for the latest Marvel movie. And I am a husband and a father and a Temptations fan and a Bruce Springsteen fan and a history buff and a writer and a guy on Atkins, and although it has caused me nothing but pain lately, the last few years, a diehard fan of the Los Angeles Lakers. Would you, all of those things are me, all of them relevant to understanding me in some circumstances and completely irrelevant in others, but would you ask that one of those things define me, constrain me, be who I am all day, every day, in every circumstance from here to eternity? So we began with a question. We said, define race. Did you decide that race was color of skin? Is it having dark skin that makes you African American? If that is the case, then what shall we say about Parminder Nagra? She is a dark-skinned actress, British actress, whose parents immigrated to the United Kingdom from the Punjab region of India. How shall we draw the objective scientific line between her and Taraji P. Henson, who is a dark-skinned American actress whose parents raised her in Washington, D.C.? If race is skin color, what shall we say about Walter White? White, who died in 1955, was the executive secretary of the NAACP. His autobiography begins, and I quote, "I am a Negro. My skin is white. My eyes are blue. My hair is blonde." And what shall we say about Gregory Howard Williams? He is an educator, the author of a riveting memoir, which is entitled "Life on the Color Line: The True Story of a White Boy Who Discovered That He Was Black." So maybe you say, okay, race is not skin color, but it's geography, it is ancestry, it is where your people's people are from. In which case, what shall we say about Charlize Theron? Charlize Theron was born in Johannesburg. She is the daughter of Afrikaner parents. In 2008, she became a naturalized American citizen. So by my recollection, that makes this Academy Award-winning actress, by definition, African American. Or maybe you say that, okay, race is about culture, it is about style, it is about how you dress, how you sing, how you move, in which case, how do we account for Elvis Presley, Vanilla Ice, Robin Thicke, Michael Rappaport, and yes, Justin Bieber? Or maybe it's time that we finally accept that this is just something that we invented. Maybe it's time that we accept that this is a boundary that we chose. That day in South Florida 23 years ago, all of the fences, all of the boundaries, both real and metaphorical, had come down. In that context of human need, that woman that I met did not care that I was black. I did not care that she was white. All either of us cared about was that maybe we could help one another get through what we were going through. All either of us cared about was, I've got some ice, you've got some chicken. Nothing else was important to us. And I submit to you that if it did not matter then, maybe it never really mattered at all.